I became so absorbed in Philip Castle's book that I didn't even look up from it when we put down for 10 minutes in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I didn't even look up when somebody behind me whispered, thrilled, that a midget had come aboard. A little while later, I looked around for the midget, but could not see him. I did not see, right in front of Hazel and H. Lowe Crosby, a horse-faced woman with platinum blonde hair, a woman new to the passenger list. Next to hers was a seat that appeared to be empty, a seat that might well have sheltered a midget without my seeing even the top of his head. But it was San Lorenzo, the land, the history, the people that intrigued me then. So I looked no harder for the midget. Midgets are, after all, diversions for silly or quiet times, and I was serious and excited about Bakunin's theory of what he called dynamic tension, his sense of a priceless equilibrium between good and evil. When I first saw the term dynamic tension in Philip Castle's book, I laughed what I imagined to be a superior laugh. The term was a favorite of Bakunin's, according to young Castle's book, and I supposed that I knew something that Bakunin didn't know. That the term was one vulgarized by Charles Atlas, a mail-order muscle builder. As I learned when I read on briefly, Bakunin knew exactly who Charles Atlas was. Bakunin was, in fact, an alumnus of his muscle-building school. It was the belief of Charles Atlas that muscles could be built without barbells or spring exercises, could be built by simply pitting one set of muscles against another. It was the belief of Bakunin that good societies could be built only by pitting good against evil and by keeping the tension between the two high at all times. And in Castle's book, I read my first Bakuninist poem, or Calypso. It went like this: Papa Manzano, he's so very bad, but without bad Papa, I would be so sad, because without Papa's badness, tell me if you would, how could wicked old Bakunin ever look good? Bakunin, I learned from Castle's book, was born in 1891. He was born an Episcopalian and a British subject on the island of Tobago. He was christened Lionel Boyd Johnson. He was the youngest of 6 children born to a wealthy family. His family's wealth derived from the discovery of Bakunin's grandfather of $250,000 in buried pirate treasure, presumably a treasure of Blackbeard of Edward Teach. Blackbeard's treasure was reinvested by Bakunin's family in asphalt, copra, cacao, livestock, and poultry. Young Lionel Boyd Johnson was educated in Episcopal schools, did well as a student, and was more interested in ritual than most. As a youth, for all his interest in the outward trappings of organized religion, he seems to have been a carouser, for he invites us to sing along with him in his 14th Calypso. When I was young, I was so gay and mean. I drank and chased the girls just like young St. Augustine. St. Augustine, he got to be a saint. So if I get to be one also, please, Mama, don't you faint. Lionel Boyd Johnson was intellectually ambitious enough in 1911 to sail alone from Tobago to London in a sloop named the Lady's Slipper. His purpose was to gain a higher education. He enrolled in the London School of Economics and Political Science. His education was interrupted by the First World War. He enlisted in the infantry, fought with distinction, was commissioned in the field, was mentioned 4 times in dispatches. He was gassed in the Second Battle of Ypres, was hospitalized for 2 years, and then discharged. And he set sail for home, for Tobago, alone in the Lady's Slipper again. When only 80 miles from home, he was stopped and searched by a German submarine, the U-99. He was taken prisoner, and his little vessel was used by the Huns for target practice. While still surfaced, the submarine was surprised and captured by the British destroyer, the Raven. Johnson and the Germans were taken on board the destroyer, and the U-99 was sunk. The Raven was bound for the Mediterranean, but it never got there. It lost its steering. It could only wallow helplessly or make grand clockwise circles. It came to rest at last in the Cape Verde Islands. Johnson stayed in those islands for 8 months, awaiting some sort of transportation to the Western Hemisphere. He got a job at last as a crewman on a fishing vessel that was carrying illegal immigrants to New Bedford, Massachusetts. The vessel was blown ashore at Newport, Rhode Island. By that time, Johnson had developed a conviction that something was trying to get him somewhere for some reason. So he stayed in Newport for a while to see if he had a destiny there. He worked as a gardener and carpenter on the famous Rumford estate. During that time, he glimpsed many distinguished guests of the Rumfords, among them J.P. Morgan, General J. Pershing, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Enrico Caruso, Warren Gamaliel Harding, and Harry Houdini. And it was during that time that the First World War came to an end, having killed 10 million persons and wounded 20 million, Johnson among them. When the war ended, the young rake-hell of the Rumford family, Remington Rumford IV, proposed to sail his steam yacht, the Scheherazade, around the world, visiting Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Egypt, India, China, and Japan. He invited Johnson to accompany him as first mate, and Johnson agreed. Johnson saw many wonders of the world on the voyage. The Scheherazade was rammed in a fog in Bombay Harbor, and only Johnson survived. He stayed in India for 2 years, becoming a follower of the Mohandas K. Gandhi. He was arrested for leading groups that protested British rule by lying down on railroad tracks. When his first jail term was over, he was shipped at Crown expense to his home in Tobago. There he built another schooner, which he called the Lady Slipper II. And he sailed her about the Caribbean in an idler, still seeking the storm that would drive him ashore on what was unmistakably his destiny. In 1922, he sought shelter from a hurricane in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, which country was then occupied by United States Marines. Johnson was approached there by a brilliant, self-educated, idealistic Marine deserter named Earl McCabe. McCabe was a corporal. He had just stolen his company's recreation fund. He offered Johnson $500 for transportation to Miami. The two set sail for Miami, but a gale hounded the schooner onto the rocks of San Lorenzo. The boat went down. Johnson and McCabe, absolutely naked, managed to swim ashore. As Buchanan himself reports the adventure, "A fish pitched up by the angry sea, I gasped on land, and I became me." He was enchanted by the mystery of coming ashore naked on an unfamiliar island. He resolved to let the adventure run its full course, resolved to see just how a man might go emerging naked from the water. It was a rebirth for him. Be like a baby, the Bible says. So I stay like a baby to this very day. How he came by the name of Buchanan was very simple. Buchanan was the pronunciation given the name Johnson in the island's English dialect. As for that dialect, the dialect of San Lorenzo is both easy to understand and difficult to write down. I say it is easy to understand, but I speak only for myself. Others have found it as incomprehensible as Basque, so my understanding of it may be telepathic. Philip Castle, in his book, gave a phonetic demonstration of that dialect and caught its flavor very well. He chose for his sample the San Lorenzo version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And in American English, one version of that immortal poem goes like this. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, shining in the sky so bright like a tea tray in the night. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. In San Lorenzo dialect, according to Castle, the same person went like this. Svent cool, let pur stor, cogit vantur bat vujor. Puchvishinik an lo shizo brath, kamun titran o lanath. Svent cool, let pur stor, cogit vantur bat vujor. Shortly after Johnson became Buchanan, incidentally, the lifeboat of his shattered ship was found on shore. That boat was later painted gold and made the bed of the island's chief executive. There is a legend made up by Buchanan. Philip Castle wrote in his book that the golden boat will sail again when the end of the world is near. My reading of the life of Buchanan was interrupted by H. Lowe Crosby's wife, Hazel. She was standing in the aisle next to me. You'll never believe it, she said, but I just found 2 more Hoosiers on this airplane. I'll be damned. They weren't born Hoosiers, but they live there now. They live in Indianapolis. Very interesting. You want to meet them? You think I should? The question baffled her. They're your Hoosiers. What are their names? Her name is Connors, and his name is Honecker. They're brother and sister, and he's a midget. He's a nice midget, though, she winked. He's a smart little thing. Does he call you Mom? I almost asked him to, and then I stopped, and I wondered if maybe it would be rude to ask a midget to do that. Nonsense. So I went after to talk to Angela Honecker Connors and little Newton Honecker, members of my chorus. Angela was the horse-faced platinum blonde I had noticed earlier. Newt was a very young, very tiny young man indeed, though not grotesque. He was as nicely scaled as Gulliver among the Brobdingnagians, and as shrewdly watchful too. He held a glass of champagne which was included in the price of his ticket. That glass was to him what a fishbowl would have been to a normal man, but he drank from it with elegant ease, as though he and the glass could not have been better matched. The little son of a bitch had a crystal of Ice 9 in the thermos bottle in his luggage, and so did his miserable sister, while under us was God's own amount of water, the Caribbean Sea. When Hazel got all the pleasure she could from introducing Hoosiers to Hoosiers, she left us alone. Remember, she said as she left us, "From now on, call me Mom." "Okay, Mom," I said. "Okay, Mom," said Newt. His voice was fairly high, in keeping with his little larynx, but he managed to make that voice distinctly masculine. Angela persisted in treating Newt like an infant, and he forgave her for it with an amiable grace I would have thought impossible for one so small. Newt and Angela remembered me, remembered the letters I'd written, and invited me to take the empty seat in their group of 3. Angela apologized to me for never having answered my letters. I could think of anything to say that would interest anybody reading a book. I could have made up something about that day, but I didn't think you'd want that. Actually, the day was just like a regular day. Your brother here wrote me a very good letter. Angela was surprised. Newt did? How could Newt remember anything? She turned to him. Honey, you don't remember anything about that day, do you? You were just a baby. I remember, he said mildly. I wish I could see her. She implied that Newt was still too immature to deal directly with the outside world. Angela was a god-awfully insensitive woman, feeling for what smallness meant. Excuse me. Honey, you should have showed me that letter, she scolded. Sorry, said Newt, I didn't think. I might as well tell you, Angela said to me. Dr. Breed told me I wasn't supposed to cooperate with you. He said you weren't interested in giving a fair picture of Father. She showed me that she didn't like me for that. I placated her some by telling her that the book would probably never be done anyway, that I no longer had a clear idea of what it would or should mean. Well, if you ever do the book, you better make a fair father a saint, because that's what he was. I promised that I would do my best to paint that picture. I asked if she and Newt were bound for a family reunion with Frank and San Lorenzo. Frank's getting married, said Angela. We're going to the engagement party. Oh? Who's the lucky girl? I'll show you, said Angela, and she took from her purse a billfold that contained a sort of plastic accordion. In each of the accordion's pleats was a photograph. Angela flipped through the photographs, giving me glimpses of little Newt on a Cape Cod beach, of Dr. Felix Henneker accepting his Nobel Prize, of Angela's own homely twin girls, of Frank flying a model plane on the end of a string. And then she showed me a picture of the girl Frank was going to marry. She might, with equal effect, have struck me in the groin. The picture showed me was of Mona Amons Monzano, the woman I loved. Once Angela had opened her plastic accordion, she was reluctant until someone had looked at every photograph. There are the people I love, she declared. So I looked at the people she loved. What she had trapped in plexiglass, what she had trapped like fossil beetles in amber, were the images of a large part of our caress. There wasn't a grand fouliner in the collection. There were many photographs of Dr. Henneker, father of a bomb, father of 3 children, father of Ice 9. He was a little person, the purported sire of a midget and a giantess. My favorite picture of the old man in Angela's fossil collection showed him all bundled up for winter, in an overcoat, scarf, galoshes, and a wool knit cap with a big pom-pom on the crown. This picture, Angela told me, with a catch in her throat, and had been taken in Hyannis. Just about 3 hours before the old man died, a newspaper photographer had recognized the seeming Christmas elf for the great man he was. Did your father die in the hospital? Oh no, he died in our cottage in a big white wicker chair facing the sea. Newt and Frank had gone walking down the beach in the snow. It was a very warm snow, said Newt. It was almost like walking through orange blossoms. It was very strange. Nobody was any of the other cottages. Ours was the only one with heat, said Angela. Nobody within miles, recalled Newt wonderingly. And Frank and I came across this big black dog out on the beach, a Labrador retriever. We threw sticks into the ocean and he brought them back. I'd gone back into the village for more Christmas tree bulbs, said Angela. We had always had a tree. Did your father enjoy having a Christmas tree? He never said Newt. I think he liked it, said Angela. He just wasn't very demonstrative. Some people aren't. And some people are, said Newt. He gave a small shrug. Anyway, said Angela. When we got back home, we found him in the chair. She shook her head. I don't think he suffered any. He just looked asleep. He couldn't have looked like that if he'd been the least bit of pain. He left out an interesting part of the story. She left out the fact that it was on the same Christmas Eve that she and Frank and little Newt had divided up the old man's ice 9. Angela encouraged me to go on looking at the snapshots. That's me, if you can believe it. She showed me an adolescent girl, 6 feet tall. She was holding a clarinet in the picture, wearing the marching uniform of the Ilium High School band. Her hair was tucked up under a bandsman's hat. She was smiling with shy good cheer. Angela, a woman to whom God had given virtue with which to catch a man, showed me a picture of. So that's Harrison C. Connors. I was stunned. Her husband was a strikingly handsome man and looked as though he knew it. He was a snappy dresser and had the lazy rapture of a Don Juan about the eyes. What does he do? I asked. He's president of Fabritech. Electronics? I couldn't tell you. Even if I knew, it's all very secret government work. Weapons? Well, war anyway. How did you happen to meet? He used to work as a laboratory assistant to Father, said Angela. Then he went out to Indianapolis and started Fabritech. So your marriage to him was a happy ending to a long romance? No. I didn't even know he knew I was alive. I used to think he was nice, but he never paid any attention to me until after Father died. One day he came through Ilium. I was sitting around that big old house thinking my life was over. She spoke of the awful days and weeks that followed her father's death. Just me and little Newt in that big old house. Frank had disappeared, and the ghosts were making 10 times as much noise as Newt and I were. I'd given my whole life to taking care of Father, driving him to and from work, bundling him up when it was cold, unbundling him when it was hot, making him eat, paying his bills. Suddenly, there wasn't anything for me to do. I'd never had any close friends, didn't have a soul to turn it to but Newt. And then, she continued, there was a knock on the door, and there stood Harrison Connors. He was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. He came in, and we talked about Father's last days and about old times in general. Angela almost cried now. 2 weeks later, we were married. Returning to my own seat in the plane, feeling far shabbier for having lost Mona Ammons Manzano to Frank, I resumed my reading of Philip Castle's manuscript. I looked up Manzano Mona Ammons in the index, and he was told by the index to see Ammons Mona. So I saw Ammons Mona and found almost as many page references as I'd found after the name of Papa Manzano himself. And after Ammons Mona came Ammons Nestor, so I turned to the few pages that had to do with Nestor, and I learned that he was Mona's father, a native Finn, an architect. Nestor Ammons was captured by the Russians, liberated by the Germans during the Second World War. He was not returned home by his liberators, but was forced to serve in the Wehrmacht engineer unit that was sent to fight the Yugoslav partisans. He was captured by Chetniks, royalist Serbian partisans, and then by communist partisans who attacked the Chetniks. He was liberated by Italian parachutists who surprised the communists. And he was shipped to Italy. The Italians put him to work designing fortifications for Sicily. He stole a fishing boat in Sicily and reached neutral Portugal. While there, he met an American draft dodger named Julian Castle. Castle, upon learning that Ammons was an architect, invited him to come with him to the island of San Lorenzo and to design for him a hospital to be called House of Hope and Mercy in the Jungle. Ammons accepted. He designed the hospital, married a native woman called Celia, fathered a perfect daughter, and died. As for the life of Ammons Mona, the index itself gave a jangling, surrealistic picture of the many conflicting forces that had been brought to bear on her and her dismayed reactions to them. Ammons Mona, the index said, adopted by Manzano in order to boost Manzano's popularity, 194 to 199, 216 North Childhood and Compound of House of Hope. I showed this index entry to the Mintons, asked them if they didn't think it was an enchanting biography in itself, a biography of a reluctant goddess of love. I got an unexpectedly expert answer, as one does in life sometimes. It appeared that Claire Minton, in her time, had been a professional indexer. I had never heard of such a profession before. She told me that she had put her husband through college years before with her earnings as an indexer, that the earnings had been good, and that few people could index well. She said that indexing was a thing that only the most amateurish author undertook to do for his own book. I asked her what she thought of Philip Castle's job. Flattering to the author, insulting to the reader, she said. In a hyphenated word, she observed, with the shrewd amiability of an expert, self-indulgent. I'm always embarrassed when I see an index an author has made of his own work. Embarrassed? It's a revealing thing, an author's index of his own work, she informed me. It's a shameless exhibition to the trained eye. She can read character from an index, said her husband. Oh? I said, what can you tell about Philip Castle? She smiled faintly. Things I'd better not tell strangers. Sorry. He's obviously in love with this Mona Amons Manzano, she said. That's true of every man in San Lorenzo, I gather. He has mixed feelings about his father, she said. That's true of every man on earth, I egged her on gently. He's insecure. What mortal isn't, I demanded. I didn't know it then, but that was a very Baconist thing to demand. He'll never marry her. Why not? I've said all I'm going to say, she said. I'm gratified to meet an indexer who respects the privacy of others. Never index your own book, she stated. A Dupris Baconin tells us is a valuable instrument for gaining and developing in the privacy of an interminable love affair insights that are queer but true. The Minton's cunning exploration of indexes was surely a case in point. A Dupris, Baconin tells us, is also a sweetly conceited establishment. The Minton's establishment was no exception. Sometime later, Ambassador Minton and I met in the aisle of the airplane, away from his wife, and he showed that it was important to him that I respect what his wife could find out from indexes. You know why Castle will never marry the girl, even though he loves her, even though she loves him, even though they grew up together, he whispered. No, sir, I don't. Because he's a homosexual, whispered Minton. She can tell that from an index, too. When Lionel Boyd Johnson and Corporal Earl McCabe were washed up naked onto the shore of San Lorenzo, I read, they were greeted by persons far worse off than they. The people of San Lorenzo had nothing but diseases, which they were at a loss to treat or even name. By contrast, Johnson and McCabe had the glittering treasures of literacy, ambition, curiosity, gall, irreverence, health, humor, and considerable information about the outside world. From the Calypsos again. Oh, a very sorry people, yes, did I find here. Oh, they had no music, and they had no beer, and oh, everywhere where they tried to perch belonged to Castle Sugar Incorporated, or the Catholic Church. The statement of the property situation in San Lorenzo in 1922 is entirely accurate.